In the pre-dawn darkness, Ukrainian forces executed a meticulously planned, multi-layered offensive deep within Russian territory, marking one of the most daring operations in the ongoing conflict. The operation targeted Belgar and Voron, two strategically critical cities that acted as the first line of defense for Moscow, the political and military heart of Russia. Ukrainian commanders had spent weeks analyzing terrain, supply routes, radar coverage, and enemy positioning, allowing them to identify vulnerabilities in the outer defenses that had long been assumed impenetrable. As the first signs of night faded, long-range drones lifted off from concealed locations, cutting silently through the cold air with precision-engineered guidance systems, each one programmed to scout, strike, and feed real-time intelligence back to command centers. These drones, costing a fraction of more expensive missile systems, were deployed en masse, overwhelming early warning radars and confusing enemy tracking operators. Simultaneously, loitering munitions hovered on standby, waiting for optimal moments to descend upon strategic points, while Atom's missiles, each worth millions of dollars, roared from camouflaged launch sites, their boosters lighting the night sky like streaks of artificial dawn. The timing of the strikes was crucial. Every missile, every drone, and every electronic probe was coordinated to strike simultaneously, creating a cascade effect that left Russian forces scrambling to react, often too late to counter the initial wave. The operation's brilliance lay not merely in its destructive capability, but in its psychological and strategic impact. The sudden eruption of strikes created a controlled chaos, disorienting commanders and operators who relied heavily on their sensor networks and predictable response protocols. Belgar and Voron, despite their fortifications and defensive preparations, became flashpoints of confusion, where conventional defensive strategies failed to adapt quickly to the speed, coordination, and unpredictability of Ukrainian tactics. Roads, railways, and communication lines became contested zones within minutes as drones pierced gaps in coverage. Loitering munitions disrupted logistical hubs, and missile strikes shattered radar and supply depots. Ukrainian forces had essentially designed a shockwave, a multidimensional assault that struck across the electromagnetic spectrum, as well as the physical battlefield. The offensive also demonstrated the emerging role of layered, hybrid warfare in modern conflicts. Traditional artillery bombardments and infantry advances were supplemented by robotic units, electronic countermeasures, and real-time data sharing between UAVs, reconnaissance teams, and command networks. The objective was not only to destroy key infrastructure, but also to create conditions where Russian forces could not effectively coordinate a response, effectively neutralizing the advantage of proximity to Moscow. In many ways, the operation resembled a controlled experiment in high-intensity, high-tech warfare, where speed, timing, and integrated systems mattered as much, if not more, than sheer firepower. Russian units, trained to respond to conventional assaults, were forced into reactive positions, often firing blindly or hesitating as they attempted to identify real threats among the flurry of UAV signals, missile trajectories, and electronic interference. From a tactical perspective, the simultaneous strikes forced Russian command centers into a state of constant reprioritization. Atom's missiles targeted not only physical infrastructure, but also key nodes that coordinated air defenses and troop movements, creating cascading failures in communication and coordination. Meanwhile, long-range drones and loitering munitions penetrated gaps in radar coverage, mapping out supply lines, artillery positions, and troop formations, and relaying this information back to Ukrainian operators in real time. The result was a battlefield where Ukrainian forces operated with unparalleled situational awareness, while Russian defenders struggled to separate illusion from reality. Each successive strike compounded the confusion, reducing the enemy's ability to respond effectively, while amplifying the psychological impact of being continuously under threat from multiple vectors. Strategically, the offensive's early hours sent a clear message. Ukraine was capable of projecting power deep into Russian territory, challenging assumptions of security that had previously shaped Moscow's military planning. By striking at Belgar and Voron, Ukrainian forces aimed to destabilize the outer defenses, forcing Russia to reconsider the viability of relying on fortified buffer zones. The assault's success depended not only on high-tech weapons, but also on human coordination, discipline, and timing, demonstrating that modern warfare is increasingly defined by integrated operations that combine intelligence, precision strike capabilities, and rapid maneuvering. As Ukrainian drones, missiles, and robotic units moved through the landscape, each action was a carefully calculated step toward undermining Russia's defensive posture and seizing the initiative, illustrating a new standard of offensive sophistication. The early hours of this operation were not merely an attack. They were a demonstration of modern, networked warfare in its most advanced form, setting the stage for a conflict that could reshape the strategic balance in the region. Following the initial breakthrough into Russian territory, Ukraine's offensive evolved into a sophisticated display of combined arms and electronic warfare, integrating mechanized infantry, armored units, and autonomous combat robots in a synchronized operation that redefined the battlefield. Ukrainian forces understood that speed alone was insufficient. To maintain the initiative and prevent Russian forces from regrouping, they had to simultaneously dominate the physical terrain and the electromagnetic spectrum. Mechanized infantry units moved in tight formations, supported by advanced T-84 tanks, each valued at millions of dollars, providing both firepower and protection for infantry as they advanced along contested corridors. The infantry units, often mounted on motorcycles or light armored vehicles, maneuvered quickly through gaps created by preliminary strikes, allowing them to exploit weaknesses in Russian defenses and maintain relentless pressure. These human-led units were complemented by autonomous combat robots, small, agile machines armed with rifles, grenade launchers, and mine-laying capabilities, designed to operate in dangerous zones ahead of or alongside the troops. The robots scouted roads, cleared obstacles, and engaged small enemy contingents, acting as both force multipliers and early warning systems, feeding live data back to command networks and creating a level of situational awareness that traditional reconnaissance could not achieve. Electronic warfare formed the invisible backbone of the operation, shaping the battlefield in Ukraine's favor. Advanced jamming systems flooded Russian radar networks and communication channels with interference, rendering sensors unreliable and decision-making delayed. Radar screens that had once provided clarity now displayed ghost signals, phantom blips, and noise, forcing Russian operators to question every detection. This disruption allowed Ukrainian UAVs to traverse enemy airspace with minimal risk, mapping supply lines, artillery positions, and troop movements while staying below radar thresholds. Loitering munitions exploited these windows of opportunity, descending upon vulnerable targets with surgical precision. Mine-laying robots followed the lead of the UAVs, strategically placing obstacles along key access routes and armored vehicle lanes. When Russian armored columns attempted to advance, these pre-positioned mines created chaos, funneling vehicles into predictable kill zones where Ukrainian anti-tank teams and combat robots could strike with devastating effect. The synergy between robotics, drones, and human forces ensured that each element complemented the other, producing outcomes far greater than the sum of individual actions. Synchronization was a defining feature of this phase. Ukrainian forces had meticulously timed every action to maximize its impact. Drones disrupted surveillance while mines hindered mobility. Tanks and infantry exploited the resulting gaps, and autonomous robots provided both offensive and defensive coverage. Each element moved in concert, guided by real-time intelligence, sophisticated communication networks, and centralized command oversight. This level of coordination demanded disciplined execution and flawless timing, because a single misstep could allow Russian forces to identify vulnerabilities and counterattack effectively. Yet Ukraine demonstrated an operational rhythm that blended human decision-making, machine precision, and electronic control, creating a battlefield where every move was calculated, every strike anticipated, and every advantage exploited. The integration of electronic warfare with conventional and robotic units highlighted a fundamental shift in modern combat. Superiority is no longer just about numbers or firepower, but about the ability to dominate information, disrupt decision-making, and control both tangible and intangible dimensions of the battlefield simultaneously. The use of advanced jamming and signal disruption also imposed a psychological toll on Russian forces. Commanders and operators found themselves facing an environment where their most trusted tools, radars, communication links, and sensor networks, could no longer be relied upon. Decisions had to be made under uncertainty, often based on incomplete or misleading data, while attacks arrived with surgical precision from unseen angles. The confusion created openings that Ukrainian mechanized units and robots exploited with deadly efficiency. By combining traditional firepower with electronic dominance, Ukraine created what military analysts would describe as a force multiplier effect, where the same number of troops and machines achieved exponentially greater results because of the battlefield advantage provided by information control and technological integration. Ultimately, this phase of the offensive demonstrated a new model of modern warfare. It emphasized speed, precision, and the seamless integration of physical and electronic capabilities. Ukraine's forces were able to strike, maneuver, and react faster than their opponents, maintaining the initiative while denying Russia the ability to stabilize its defenses. The combination of mechanized infantry, armored units, autonomous robots, UAVs, loitering munitions, and electronic warfare systems did more than achieve tactical victories. It illustrated a paradigm shift in how wars could be fought in the 21st century. The battlefield became a dynamic, multidimensional environment where information dominance, precision strikes, and synchronized operations were as critical as raw firepower, and where the interplay between humans and machines dictated the pace and outcome of engagements. In these opening maneuvers, Ukraine did not merely fight. It demonstrated mastery over the full spectrum of modern combat, setting a standard for operations that integrate technology, coordination, and strategic foresight to overwhelm and outmaneuver a conventionally stronger opponent. As the Ukrainian offensive pressed deeper into Russian territory, the front lines drew ever closer to Moscow, bringing the war to the very doorstep of the capital for the first time in modern history. The advance was methodical yet relentless, combining high-tech precision strikes with coordinated maneuvers on the ground. Ukrainian forces relied heavily on drones and precision-guided missiles to systematically dismantle key infrastructure supporting Moscow's defensive network. Supply depots, fuel storage facilities, and radar installations, the critical nodes that enabled the Russian military to monitor and respond to threats, were methodically targeted, igniting fires and causing secondary explosions that reverberated across the region. The cumulative effect of these strikes was both physical and psychological. Plumes of smoke rose over the horizon, signaling the destruction of essential logistical and surveillance capabilities, while shock waves from missile detonations shattered windows and disrupted daily life in towns surrounding the capital. These operations revealed that Moscow's outer defenses, long considered impregnable, were far more vulnerable than previously believed. Ukrainian forces applied a multi-layered approach that combined the advantages of speed, technology, and tactical ingenuity. Drones scouted ahead, mapping enemy positions and relaying real-time intelligence to mobile command units, which then coordinated strikes with surgical precision. Loitering munitions and precision missiles exploited gaps in radar coverage, striking targets that were previously thought to be secure behind multiple layers of air defense. Fuel depots erupted in fireballs that sent debris high into the air, while radar stations and supply warehouses were reduced to rubble. The destruction of these nodes disrupted Russian command and control, forcing local units to operate with fragmented information and limited coordination. Every successful strike amplified the pressure on Moscow's defenders, creating a cascade effect in which one compromised facility exposed vulnerabilities elsewhere. The offensive's effectiveness lay not in sheer volume of firepower alone, but in its ability to strategically undermine the foundations of the city's defensive posture. The psychological impact of these strikes on Russian military planners was immediate and profound. Commanders in Moscow were confronted with a reality they had long considered impossible. The outer shield protecting the capital was no longer secure. The necessity of defending Moscow forced the Kremlin to redeploy precious air defense resources from the front lines to the city's perimeter, creating gaps along the primary battlefront. This redistribution of assets introduced a dangerous vulnerability for Russian troops still engaged with Ukrainian forces in buffer zones, effectively stretching their defenses thinner and reducing the overall effectiveness of their response. Radar systems that provided early warning of incoming attacks were now partially offline or unreliable due to repeated missile and drone strikes, and communication networks were increasingly jammed or overloaded with conflicting reports. In effect, Ukraine had created a scenario in which Moscow itself became a pressure point, forcing Russian forces to fight a defensive battle on two fronts, both in the field and within the airspace of the capital. The Ukrainian offensive also demonstrated the increasing importance of precision and information dominance in modern warfare. Unlike conventional assaults that rely on mass troops and artillery barges, this campaign leveraged a combination of small, precise units, guided munitions, and electronic disruption to achieve maximum impact with minimal exposure. Every strike was carefully calculated to maximize disruption, with secondary explosions multiplying the destructive effect of a single missile or drone impact. Fuel storage facilities ignited chain reactions that destroyed nearby depots, while radar stations were neutralized without necessarily requiring direct engagement. This approach minimized Ukrainian casualties, while exponentially increasing the operational strain on Russian defenses. The ability to conduct coordinated, multi-vector attacks across a broad swath of territory forced Russian decision-makers to constantly reassess their priorities, often reacting to crises rather than implementing proactive strategies. Strategically, this phase of the operation reshaped the defensive landscape around Moscow. By breaching the outer shield, Ukraine demonstrated that the capital's air defenses were not invulnerable and that well-coordinated, technologically advanced attacks could penetrate even the most fortified areas. The offensive effectively blurred the line between frontline combat and strategic strikes on critical infrastructure, creating a new paradigm in which modern warfare combines kinetic attacks, electronic warfare, and precision targeting to achieve objectives that once would have required a far larger force. The consequences of this breach were far-reaching. It forced Russia to divert resources, expose vulnerabilities in critical defense networks, and signal to the world that the war was no longer confined to peripheral regions. For Ukrainian forces, the advance was more than a tactical victory. It was proof that even most heavily defended strategic targets could be challenged through innovation, coordination, and relentless execution. By the time the dust and smoke began to settle over the outskirts of Moscow, it was clear that the offensive had not only damaged infrastructure, but had also altered the strategic equation in the region. The perimeter defenses of the capital had been compromised, logistical lines disrupted, and radar networks degraded. Ukrainian operations demonstrated that success in modern conflict depends not solely on brute force, but on the ability to control the battlefield across multiple domains simultaneously: air, land, and electronic. Moscow, long perceived as untouchable, now faced an unprecedented threat, and the Kremlin was forced to reconsider both its military posture and the assumptions that had guided decades of defensive planning. The breach of the outer shield marked a historic turning point, proving that precision, coordination, and technological superiority could redefine the limits of modern warfare. The culmination of Ukraine's offensive demonstrated more than just tactical success. It sent a strategic message that Russia's previously assumed impenetrable defenses could be challenged, breached, and controlled under the right combination of technology, planning, and execution. Ukrainian forces had shown the world that a relatively smaller military, when equipped with advanced drones, precision missiles, electronic warfare systems, and autonomous combat units, could overcome formidable fortifications and alter the balance of power on the battlefield. As Ukrainian drones and loitering munitions swept across the outskirts of Moscow, precision strikes targeted depots, radar installations, and fuel storage sites, creating widespread chaos and crippling the city's outer defensive network. Missile strikes and drone attacks triggered secondary explosions, fires, and the collapse of infrastructure, demonstrating that modern warfare no longer relied solely on mass ground forces, but on speed, accuracy, and the ability to control both kinetic and digital domains simultaneously. The offensive not only exposed vulnerabilities in Russian defensive systems, but also highlighted Ukraine's mastery of multi-domain operations, where control of the electromagnetic spectrum, intelligence gathering, and synchronized strikes became as critical as firepower. Amid the devastation, Ukrainian forces also showcased a commitment to humanitarian principles even during intense conflict. Soldiers moved methodically through contested zones, rescuing and aiding wounded Russian troops caught in the crossfire. Despite being adversaries, Ukrainian units provided medical assistance, evacuated the injured to safe areas, and ensured that the humanitarian aspect of warfare was not lost amid the chaos. These actions underscore a profound contrast. While the physical and electronic battlefield was dominated by relentless precision, coordination, and destruction, the human element remained central to Ukraine's operational ethos. The rescue of wounded soldiers and the provision of aid under fire also served a strategic purpose, maintaining moral high ground and reinforcing the distinction between disciplined, principled forces and indiscriminate aggression. By balancing overwhelming force with ethical conduct, Ukraine demonstrated a level of sophistication in modern military operations that goes beyond conventional measures of success. By the first light of dawn, the consequences of the offensive became unmistakably clear. Ukrainian forces had reached the outer gates of Moscow, a feat that had previously been considered unthinkable. The physical proximity of troops, drones, and autonomous combat units to the capital reshaped the strategic calculus for both sides. Russian commanders were forced to divert key air defense systems, redeploy radar and missile units, and reconsider frontline priorities to protect the capital, inadvertently weakening defensive capabilities elsewhere along the border. The reach of the Ukrainian offensive had expanded beyond immediate tactical victories into strategic leverage. By threatening Moscow itself, Ukraine introduced uncertainty into Russia's planning and demonstrated that previously static, heavily fortified positions were no longer invulnerable to coordinated multi-domain attacks. The offensive exemplified how precision, technology, and coordination could redefine operational reach and strategic effect in modern warfare. Electronic and drone warfare were at the heart of this transformation. Ukrainian forces employed swarms of drones operating at low altitudes, precision-guided missiles, and sophisticated jamming systems to manipulate Russian sensor networks, degrade radar effectiveness, and disrupt command and control structures. The combined impact of these technologies allowed Ukraine to maintain battlefield initiative, strike with pinpoint accuracy, and move forces rapidly without being fully detected or countered. By controlling both the physical battlefield and the electromagnetic environment, Ukrainian units effectively forced Russian forces to operate in a state of constant uncertainty, where reaction times were delayed, targeting accuracy was compromised, and resource allocation became a reactive struggle. This demonstrated that modern conflict is no longer determined solely by troop numbers or conventional artillery. Mastery of information, surveillance, and unmanned systems can achieve effects previously considered impossible. The operation also had profound implications for the broader strategic balance in the region. By proving that Moscow's perimeter could be breached and its defenses manipulated, Ukraine altered perception of invulnerability that had long surrounded the Russian capital. International observers and military analysts recognized that modern warfare had shifted toward a new paradigm, where technological integration, precision strikes, and real-time intelligence could offset numerical and conventional superiority. For Ukraine, the offensive provided not only a battlefield advantage, but also a symbolic and psychological victory. The war had reached the gates of Moscow, demonstrating the credibility of Ukrainian military power and the vulnerability of the Russian defense apparatus. The success of the operation illustrated that with disciplined execution, technological innovation, and careful planning, a smaller force could project strategic influence deep into enemy territory, challenging assumptions and reshaping the theater of war. In conclusion, the operation's legacy extended beyond the immediate destruction and disruption it caused. It proved that modern warfare is increasingly defined by integration, precision, and control of multiple domains, combining conventional forces with autonomous systems, drones, and electronic warfare to achieve decisive effects. At the same time, Ukraine's treatment of wounded Russian soldiers highlighted that humanity can coexist with technological and tactical dominance, even in the most intense conflicts. By the time the sun rose, the offensive had fundamentally changed the battlefield. Moscow's outer defenses had been tested, the strategic balance had shifted, and the war had demonstrated, in vivid terms, that electronic and drone-enabled operations could redefine the possibilities of 21st century warfare.